This may be the most important fantasy football video that you've watched so far this season. The main reason why? Well, the fantasy gods, they like to giveth. We get CeeDee Lamb back this week. Hopefully, Drake London is heated up. Heck, even Brian Thomas Jr. had a solid week. But then the fantasy football gods, they like to take it away. Marvin Harrison Jr. concussion. Emeka Egbuka's dealing with an injury. Garrett Wilson is banged up. And the #1 overall wide receiver, Puka Nacua, also injured. Now, luckily, the buys this week, we're not missing too many really good wide receivers. I'm sure that you can make it without Zay Flowers and Khalil Shakir or Keon Coleman this week with no issues. But if you're dealing with any injuries or if you've got guys underperforming at the wide receiver position, then you're locked in right now because you may have some tough choices to make this week. Thursday Night Football, the Steelers and the Cincinnati Bengals, and hopefully for everybody out there that needs Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and DK Metcalf, this game is not a snooze fest. DK Metcalf has been hot though as of recent. He's got a touchdown in 4 straight games. Over 90 receiving yards in each of his last 2 games. He's been the wide receiver 5 and the wide receiver 8 his last 2 games. So he is obviously heating up. We've got big plays to go along with the touchdowns now. Him and Aaron Rodgers seem to be on the same page, and he absolutely could take advantage of this Cincinnati defense on Thursday Night Football. And let's hope he has a big game. Calvin Austin, as of this recording, still had not practiced this week. So as of right now, I think he's officially going to be questionable and wouldn't be shocked if we find out on Wednesday that he's probably not going to play on Thursday night, which means DK Metcalf is going to get even more targets. I've got to start Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. We saw last week that these two are easily fantasy relevant every single week with a competent quarterback. Even if that quarterback's bedtime is before Thursday Night Football will kick off this week. Chase last week caught 10 of his 12 targets, 94 receiving yards and a touchdown. T. Higgins saw 8 targets and caught 5 for 62 yards. Jamar Chase obviously has the ceiling every single week. T. Higgins is going to have touchdown potential. He might not reach that ceiling. 5 receptions and 62 yards for your wide receiver too, though. Basically, based on what we've gotten from T. Higgins, we'll take that right now. On Sunday morning over in London with the Rams and the Jags playing each other, this is not the type of matchup that we want Puka Nacua to miss. The Jags are currently giving up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers right now. This is the type of matchup that Puka Nacua could have a huge day. But if he can't go, Devontae Adams should be very, very solid. But is there anybody else that you should be looking at? It does appear that Tutu Atwell is going to be set to make his return this week against the Jags, which would be excellent because if you're out there on the waiver wire right now and somebody has left Tutu Atwell sitting around because he's been injured, I would grab him up for this matchup, especially if Puka Nacua ends up being injured. We know that Stafford and Tutu Atwell have hooked up for some big plays in the past. And with no Puka, I could absolutely see that once again this week. Even though I'm not going to put him on the graphic right now, Tutu Atwell to me would be a fringe start if there's no Puka. Jordan Whittington was probably on your radar a little bit as well, but with Tutu Atwell coming back, Whittingham to me is going to be a guy that I will go ahead and pass on. Over the last 2 weeks, Brian Thomas Jr. has 170 receiving yards. If he's starting to heat up, that is excellent news for all the owners that have been desperately needing his big play potential. He's also still tied for 9th in the league in targets right now. He's getting the looks, and finally he's producing. But this is not going to be the type of matchup where we're just going to assume that it's going to happen from Brian Thomas Jr. once again. It is a tougher matchup. And while he's heating up and he should still see a fair amount of targets, I'm a little bit more worried about the ceiling this week than what I will be moving forward. New Orleans wide receivers are going to have a solid matchup this week going up against the Chicago Bears. Right now, this Bears defense is allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game, and they've also allowed 8 receiving touchdowns so far this season, even though they've also had a bye week already. And I absolutely love to see what Chris Olave did last week because he had another 10 targets. That now makes 5 out of 6 games this season in which Chris Olave has saw at least 10 targets. But it's the big playability that was finally showcased a little bit more because over the first few weeks of the season, Chris Olave was only averaging 7.5 yards per reception. Last week, that jumped all the way to 16.3 yards per reception. significant. And if we can start doing that more often, Chris Olave is going to end up being a wide receiver 3 flex option for us every single week. And in this matchup, Rashid Shaheed, not nearly as safe, but if we can have 5 or 6 targets for him, his big playability will make him a fringe start. The New Orleans defense has also allowed 8 receiving touchdowns to wide receivers this season, but they haven't had their bye as of yet. So both of these defenses are tied for third of most receiving touchdowns allowed to wide receivers so far on the year. We know DJ Moore is hurt, and he had to stay over in Washington this past week after the game before he could fly back home to Chicago. So he's probably going to be questionable at best this week, which means Rome Odunze could be in for a huge week. But it also means that maybe Luther Burden, for the first time this year, will make his way up to a fringe start for me. And Odunze had his worst game of the season this past week against Washington, but Caleb Williams barely overthrew him on what could have been a pretty big touchdown as well. And that would have changed the trajectory of the game and Odunze's fantasy week. I don't love that he only had 5 targets though. He's averaged 8.75 targets per game over the course of the season so far. So seeing a drop to 5 is not exciting, but Chicago spread the ball around a little bit more. No DJ Moore this week. We're going to take his 5 targets from last week. Let's transition them over to Luther Burden, and Luther Burden could end up seeing 5 or 6 targets as well. Odunze is probably going to be pretty easily a top 12 wide receiver for me this week and should be in your lineups. Luther Burden, for those of you that are dealing with injuries, bye weeks, whatever it may be, you're just having issues with depth, with no DJ Moore, Luther Burden could absolutely have a bigger role. I still find it to be a little bit risky though. Another defense that has allowed 8 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers, that's the Cleveland Browns. Jalen Waddle this week, for me, has some pretty solid touchdown potential. Over the last 2 weeks, he's caught 12 of his 17 targets for just over 200 receiving yards and a touchdown. He's starting to showcase that wide receiver 1 talent that we know we've had, but Tyreek Hill has really taken away from him. Now that he's going to be the guy the rest of the season, we'll see if this ends up keeping up. For this week, I don't know if we see 100 receiving yards, but I do think finding the end zone is a possibility. For as bad as Miami's defense looks in certain aspects of their game, they haven't been terrible against the pass so far. Now, one of the reasons why is teams are just running it more often. Teams have ran the ball the 4th most in the league against this Miami defense. In terms of passing attempts, though, they're about middle of the road in passing attempts against their defense. So the numbers really are kind of solid. 10th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers, 18th fewest receiving yards as well. And Jerry Jeudy is still on the fringe for me because like some other wide receivers, he's a guy that is seeing a ton of targets right now. It just hasn't translated into a ton of fantasy points. Right now, Jerry Jeudy is tied for 9th in the league in wide receiver targets. That right there puts him in fringe territory, especially in a matchup against Miami that Cleveland definitely has an opportunity to win. For New England and Tennessee, we definitely saw a change in direction for these wide receivers for the Patriots last week. Stephon Diggs looked like he was ascending. Kayshon Boutte, Demario Douglas, these guys looked like they weren't really going to be fantasy relevant every single week, and then they all just reversed course. Now this week going up against Tennessee, who has allowed the 8th most receiving yards, but have only allowed 4 receiving touchdowns on the year, we could see a decent amount of receptions, but a high upside because of touchdowns may not be there. So who are we going to start out of this group? Demario Douglas, still for the majority of the year, is irrelevant. He had a 53-yard touchdown last week, and outside of that, he hasn't done anything in weeks. So I'm going to go ahead and sit him once again because I don't think he's the answer. Before his 2 touchdown performance last week, Kayshon Boutte had finished outside the top 45 receivers every single game since week 1. So trying to find some consistency with him, I don't really think it's going to be there either. But it's going to be between him and Diggs on a weekly basis. I still think Diggs has an opportunity to continuously see his snap count increase, making him the safer wide receiver, while Boutte's going to become a guy that is really touchdown dependent. And for Tennessee, I'm not really interested in any of the wide receivers this week. Calvin Ridley is banged up. They're going to have potentially a new offensive game plan with Brian Callahan being fired this week. Alec Aomanor, he hasn't done anything. Van Jefferson, he had 6 targets last week. Are we really going to follow Van Jefferson this week going up against New England? Me personally, I think we can probably find some better options. I already talked about Luther Burden. I'd rather play Luther Burden. I already talked about Tutu Atwell. I'd rather play Tutu Atwell. There is a combination of several things that is just going to drive me away from Las Vegas wide receivers this week. Number one, first and foremost, is the play of Geno Smith. He's been terrible this season. He continues to throw interceptions, turning the ball over and taking it out of his offense's hands, which really is bad for the floor and ceiling of everyone around him. And because of that, they're running the football more with Ashton Jeanty, which is great for Ashton Jeanty owners, but it doesn't really help Jacoby Myers and Trey Tucker all that much. This also is a tough matchup against Kansas City this week. Right now, they've allowed the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And while they're ranked 13th in receptions to wide receivers, they're ranked 21st in receiving yards. While they give up a decent amount of receptions, there's not a bunch of big plays to go with them. So I think it's just safer this week to stay away from Myers and Tucker both. Rashee Rice is going to throw a wrench into what is going to happen with the Kansas City offense because Hollywood Brown had 2 receiving touchdowns last week. Xavier Worthy, probably still the wide receiver 1 on this team, but we've seen him kind of go up and down a little bit. Tyquan Thornton, he disappeared last week, but we know he's got some big playability. And then, of course, Rashee Rice is coming back, and that's not even factoring in Travis Kelce at this point. So from a wide receiver standpoint, Hollywood Brown, Tyquan Thornton, Xavier Worthy, Rashee Rice, Juju Smith-Schuster. 5 wide receivers that are going to be rotating. Add in Travis Kelce, that's 6 pass catchers that Patrick Mahomes has to spread the ball around to. Now, Las Vegas has allowed the 5th most fantasy points and receiving yards to wide receivers this year, while also allowing the 3rd most receptions. Somebody, or even a couple of people, could end up eating this week. If I had to go with anybody, I'm going to go with Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy. Rashee Rice could easily replace Hollywood Brown on this as a fringe start, and we move Hollywood Brown to a sit. But being out the first 6 weeks of the season, I wonder if it takes a week or two for Rashee Rice to fully get implemented back into the game plan and to play as many snaps as these other guys. They're not hurting for wide receivers right now, so I don't know if you just need to push Rashee Rice into an 80% snap share right away. Philadelphia has a terrible matchup against Minnesota this week for A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith to still try and get something going, so their fantasy owners see some positive progression with both of them. A.J. Brown, though, he has 8+ targets in every single game since week 1, so it's not like Jalen Hurts isn't looking at him or isn't giving him opportunities. They just haven't made anything of it yet. And Devontae Smith, he's not seeing nearly as many targets, but we know that he has more big playability than what A.J. Brown does. So right now, A.J. Brown has a decent floor. It just hasn't materialized because those targets haven't become receptions and haven't become production. And we know his ceiling is not great. For Devontae Smith, we know he has a really solid ceiling, but his floor is even way lower than A.J. Brown because he's not even seeing those targets. Now, Minnesota did allow a huge half to DK Metcalf just a couple of weeks ago, so potentially that could end up happening again with A.J. Brown or Devontae Smith. But for the most part, they shut down DK Metcalf in the second half. Philadelphia's defense has only allowed 4 receiving touchdowns to wide receivers so far this season, but they still have allowed the 9th most receiving yards. We're going to fire up Justin Jefferson. Jordan Addison, to me, is still going to be a fringe start because I think he's going to come and go at times, but so far it hasn't been bad. He's been the wide receiver 20 each of his first 2 games back. He had a touchdown in his second game. He had 114 receiving yards in his first game. If we compare those 2 things together, then he's definitely going to be inside the top 15. Since Jordan Addison returned, Justin Jefferson has also looked like a different wide receiver. He's been the wide receiver 9 and 11 with 249 total receiving yards since Jordan Addison returned. That probably is because teams can't double team Justin Jefferson anymore and have to give just much attention to Jordan Addison on the other side. Jordan Addison being back has been a great thing for Jefferson. In a great matchup against Dallas, who has given up some huge performances this season, McMillan only caught 3 of 5 targets for 29 receiving yards. We got to start putting it all together. We have to start having the volume and the yards and the touchdowns for Ted McMillan to truly be a breakout fantasy wide receiver. He got all the way up to wide receiver 12 this past week, but partly because a lot of people sucked and there were a ton of injuries. And wide receivers have not done a ton against the Jets this season so far either. Now, part of the reason continues to be teams will run it way more often on the Jets than what they'll pass it. But still, at this point, they've allowed the 7th fewest fantasy points per game, and they've only allowed 4 receiving touchdowns so far. I mean, if there's going to be a matchup that Garrett Wilson has to miss, Carolina isn't the worst one for that to happen in. Right now, the Carolina defense, they're playing very well, allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers and the 7th fewest receiving yards. The only other wide receiver that has really seen any targets this season for the New York Jets has been Josh Reynolds. And I really don't know who they think is going to step up after that atrocious performance against the Denver Broncos last week. I'm going to go ahead and just skip on any New York Jet wide receiver. I don't know if I want any part of the New York Giants wide receivers this week. If you have to play somebody, it's going to have to be Wan'Dale Robinson. He's got the best floor of the group here, and even though nobody has a ceiling this week and nobody for the New York Giants will probably reach that going up against Denver, Wan'Dale Robinson could still see 7 targets this week, and if he catches 5 of them for 50 yards, I know there's way worse options out there than that. Denver's defense right now allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game, and they've only allowed 1 receiving touchdown all season long. And Lil Jordan Humphrey saw the most targets last week, but I highly doubt that happens again this week in this type of a matchup. This is a great game for Courtland Sutton to get back on track after that downer last week. And the Denver Broncos are going to spread the ball around sometimes, and when that happens, Courtland Sutton, unfortunately, is going to have a down performance. But this week going up against the New York Giants, currently allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game and the most receiving yards to wide receivers, Courtland Sutton is definitely back on track. And there's going to be inconsistencies. He has 2 games inside the top 12 this season. He has 2 games inside the top 24. And he has 2 games outside the top 70 wide receivers. That's going to continue to happen from time to time. And even in this matchup, I think Courtland Sutton is going to end up being just fine, but it wouldn't shock me if Troy Franklin or Marvin Mims, one of them were to have a solid game as well. It's just going to be really hard to pinpoint who's going to be the wide receiver 2 in any given week. If we're going to have a tough time with Courtland Sutton, we're going to even have a worse time with these other 2 guys. We're going to have a couple of different experiences with this Colts and Chargers matchup this week, because this Chargers defense is allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers right now. Michael Pittman has been a really solid wide receiver 2 with a little wide receiver 1 upside all season long. Last week, that kind of disappeared in favor of Josh Downs. So you got to wonder if Josh Downs is going to have a bigger role moving forward. Alec Pierce is going to have some big plays, but I'll target him in matchups that will allow that a little bit more often. The Indianapolis Colts, however, allow the 4th most fantasy points and receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. We're going to fire up Ladd McConkey and Keenan Allen, and we are still not sure at this point in time if Quentin Johnston will be ready to play. But even if he can, will he be 100%? Keenan Allen and Ladd McConkey are definitely going to be the guys this week. And for those of you that have struggled with Ladd McConkey, I get it. And we've gotten a ton of Discord questions over the last few weeks about Ladd McConkey. And I keep telling everybody the same thing. Don't give up on him. Just hold him, even if he's on your bench right now, because Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston could both have an injury, and if they do, he's going to be back to looking a lot like he did at the end of last season. Guess what? Quentin Johnston missed a game. Ladd McConkey looks like a top 12 wide receiver again. We've got a lot of question marks with Terry McLaurin and CeeDee Lamb. Will either of these guys, or both of them, be able to return this week? But we also have a ton of potential upside in this matchup as well. And that's why the Commanders and Cowboys will be my underdog must-watch matchup of the week at the wide receiver position. And for as tough as last week was for fantasy performances, I saw a ton of green over on Underdog on Monday Night Football. I had 6 winning tickets and absolutely smashed all of my picks on Monday Night Football. We are killing it on Underdog this year, and I think you should join us if you haven't done so yet. And the easiest way to do that is by downloading the Underdog app. create a new account and make at least a $10 deposit using code headliners. And you're gonna get a couple of awesome perks right now by signing up with code headliners. First and foremost, you're gonna get a super special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit. And you can pair that up with a ton of the pick'ems that we list either in Discord or Jake lists in his Friday videos. On top of that, when you play $5, you're gonna get up to $100 in bonus funds or contests as well. So take advantage of it right now. We have seen a ton of green over on Underdog this year, and I expect us to see a ton moving forward as well. And it'll be interesting to see what pick'ems we can get from this Cowboys and Commanders matchup, especially from the wide receivers, because Dallas right now is allowing the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. We know if Terry McLaurin returns this week, he can end up having a big week. Deebo Samuel had a really down performance last week, but he could get on board this week as well. Deebo last week only had 5 targets and he caught 4 of them for a whooping 15 receiving yards. He also had 1 rushing attempt for -1 yards. It was not a good week for Deebo. And maybe he was a little bit more banged up than what we were led to believe. He was on the same trajectory as the week before, and he killed it the week before. So I was kind of shocked to see Deebo this bad against this Bears defense last week. Now, what if Terry McLaurin doesn't play? Because Luke McCaffrey scored last week, Chris Moore had a decent game last week. For me, it comes down to 2 things. Luke McCaffrey, he has some touchdown potential. He's definitely a guy that's going to get 2, maybe 3 targets, but he could maybe score a touchdown with those targets. Chris Moore, with no Terry McLaurin, has a lot of big play potential with some more volume. Chris Moore, to me, if there's no Terry McLaurin, could end up being a fringe start, while Luke McCaffrey probably isn't quite fringe for me and is more of a desperation dart throw. Based on everything I've read, it does appear that CeeDee Lamb is on track to play this week. Now, that has not been confirmed, and he's still going to have some practices to go through to make sure he's ready. But if CeeDee Lamb plays, he is going to be a start for me. But that's not changing what I do with George Pickens. He's also going to be a start still as well. Pickens scored another touchdown this past week. This guy has been finding the end zone like crazy this season. And even when CeeDee Lamb comes back, if George Pickens sees a reduction in targets, which I'm sure he will, he's still going to have that big play and touchdown potential that he had even at the beginning of the season when CeeDee Lamb was healthy. With the return of Christian Watson getting closer and closer, you got to believe that this Green Bay wide receiver core is going to get even more difficult to try and figure out. Now, Watson wasn't close to being activated last week, but it does sound like he looked really, really good in practice. So we'll see what happens the rest of this week and whether or not Watson gets activated off the IR to play against Arizona. Even if he does come back this week, I highly doubt he sees 80% of the snaps, and I highly doubt he's super productive. I think it's probably going to take a couple of weeks for him to get into game form, which is going to leave an opportunity for Romeo Doubs and Matthew Golden still at this point. Matthew Golden, we saw some of that upside last week, some of that big playability. And even though he only caught 3 passes, he still turned him into a decent amount of receiving yards. Romeo Doubs, he saw 9 targets, couldn't find the end zone, didn't really have that big of a fantasy day, but moving forward this week, I'll have Doubs as a start and Golden as a fringe start going up against Arizona. Well, when everybody's healthy, when Wicks returns and Watson's out there and Golden and Doubs, no one's really separated themselves yet. Marvin Harrison Jr. is dealing with a concussion, and I don't know if he's going to be cleared in time to play this game. Right now, Green Bay is allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So if you're looking for a dart throw, someone that could come in and be a fringe guy for you, Zay Jones was the #1 after Marvin Harrison Jr. left last week. Now that Indianapolis defense is way easier to pass against than what Green Bay is, but that doesn't negate the fact that Zay Jones could be the lead wide receiver once again. In today's society, we live in an impatient world, and fantasy football owners are kind of the epitome of that. Because if your teams aren't producing right away and all the time, you're like, whoa, 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 what have I done wrong here? And for some people out there, not a ton in our community, it ends up coming back to me and being my fault that your team isn't performing the way I would like. For instance, Drake London. Drake London had a tough start to the season, and people were on me about it. I can't believe you sold him as a top 5 wide receiver. This guy has been trash, and I tried to tell everybody, stay patient. He got hurt in the first game of the season. He had a touchdown called back that shouldn't have been, and he had a couple of tough performances while he was trying to get healthy. Stay patient with Drake London. Things are going to be fine. Well, if you're one of those people of our community that are able to practice patience, thank you so much, because Drake London is now paying off. Wide receiver 6 and the wide receiver 2 each of the last 2 games. 26 targets, 18 receptions, 268 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. Drake London is exactly who we thought he is. Is he going to have that upside every single week? Probably not, but he's clearly the #1 target in this offense, and with good as they are running the football, it's going to leave Drake London open quite a bit. This Atlanta defense is tough. For as good as Buffalo looked at the opening of that Monday Night Football game, Atlanta's defense did a great job of shutting them down the rest of the way. And now they're getting a San Francisco offense that is banged up all over the place. They have got so many guys injured at this point. It feels like that's just been San Francisco's MO the past couple of years, unfortunately. Ricky Pearsall and Jawan Jennings are both going to be questionable as of this recording. We'll have to update you later in the week on the ranking show or with a pinned comment on this video, so keep an eye on that. Kendrick Bourne, I'm going to list as a fringe start, even going up against this Atlanta defense, allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. After his big game last week and his solid game the week before, people are going to want to play Kendrick Bourne once again. But I caution you, his upside is nowhere near what you have seen as of recent. For the first Monday night game, Tampa Bay against Detroit, which kicks off at 7 o'clock, I really don't know what to expect out of this game because all of the wide receivers for Tampa Bay are hurt, and all of the cornerbacks and safeties are either hurt or suspended for Detroit. We had to remove Chris Godwin from the slide. We didn't even have enough room for all of the names that we have to put on here right now for Tampa Bay. And we know Chris Godwin is going to be out, so it made sense to take him off. Mike Evans and Emeka Egbuka, both of them are questionable as of right now. If either of them can play this week, we will let you know with a pinned comment or in the rankings video. For now, though, we're going to have to turn our attention to Sterling Shepard, Cameron Johnson, and Tez Johnson. Now, here's the thing. Detroit's allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Reed is out. Arnold is out. Brian Branch is suspended, and Kirby Joseph is also banged up right now. Everyone in the secondary is banged up. One of these guys is going to score a touchdown. And if I had to put a bet on it, it would be either Cameron Johnson or Tez Johnson. These would be the 2 guys that I would expect to score a touchdown this week. Sterling Shepard may see the most targets out of the group, but I don't think he has the upside that either of these guys do. And because the Detroit Lions secondary is prone to giving up some bigger plays, I would give Cameron Johnson and Tez Johnson the benefit of the doubt over Sterling Shepard. And it's going to be the same old song and dance for the Detroit Lions. It doesn't matter who they play. Amon-Ra St. Brown is a top 5 wide receiver, 9 receptions last week. Unfortunately, didn't materialize into much, only 45 receiving yards, so he didn't have a super high ceiling. Jamison Williams looked really good last week, scored a touchdown, and hopefully they keep him going. But so far this season, inconsistencies have been an issue with him, and we've seen a lot more low than a lot more high. That's why he'll be fringe. Houston and Seattle, and we know Seattle's defense can be very, very good, so we'll see if they shut down Nico Collins. Now, Nico Collins, because of where you drafted him and because of his big play potential, he's still going to be a start, even though his rankings probably put him closer to a fringe start, and I think he's a guy that could land just outside the top 12 this week. He's got touchdown potential. That's the name of the game with him right now. So far this season, he has 3 touchdowns in 5 games, but he only has 1 game over 100 yards so far. The floor isn't the biggest issue right now, it's the ceiling. And this Houston defense currently allows the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but that is not going to stop us from starting JSN. He's going to be a top 10 wide receiver option once again this week. Cooper Kupp and Torrey Horton, however, against this defense, I'll pass on both of them. Headliner Nation, there was a ton of information in this video today, and hopefully some of it allowed you to start making some decisions about your fantasy lineup. But if you still have questions throughout the week, make sure you check out the rankings videos. Make sure you utilize the comment section down below and check out the comments in case we pin something about any updates that may happen with these wide receivers. Hit that like button for me, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet, and turn on the bell notifications. Headliner Nation, stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.